afternoon and welcome to an introduction to integrated risk management. Thank you so much for being here with me this afternoon. I really appreciate your time. If you could just put in the question, the chat functionality for this webinar isn't available, but you can communicate with me via the question function in the tab. So I would love to hear, for those of you that are joining, what your where you're joining from and what you're hoping to get out of the session today. Just experiencing a minor difficulty here with my screen. Give me 1 second. All right, there we go, we're good. All right, so hopefully you can see the slide, an introduction to integrated risk management. Again, for those of you that are just joining, the chat functionality is not working, but you can communicate with me via the questions. So please put in the chat where you're joining from and what you're hoping to get out of the session this afternoon. So I thought I'd start by introducing myself. My name is Amber Howard. I am one of the senior consultants and instructors at Procept and Title Shift. I am the CEO of my own consulting, coaching, and company, Amber Howard and Associates, and I have over 20 years experience working in both for-profit and not-for-profit companies in sectors like aviation, the healthcare, telecommunications, financial sector. I am a certified business analyst, project manager, and change manager. And I've also done a lot of development for myself in terms of working with people around mindset. So neuro-linguistic programming, cognitive behavior therapy, because I get that we can give people the best strategies around anything in life. And if their mindset is not a match, then our ability to be successful is going to be impacted. I am originally from New Zealand. I came to Canada when I was 10. I immigrated here, and I like to share. I think it's important for people to kind of get related and get to know us a little bit as instructors. So I'm a mom. I have 3 incredible kids, and some of the other things that I'm up to in life is I'm getting ready to step onto the TEDx stage as a public speaker, and I'm in the process of writing a book called Yardsticks, which is around how do we create a life that we love based on our own measures for success and happiness. So that's a little bit about me, why this topic is so fascinating, and to me personally is I spent a year or more of my career while I was working at Toronto Pearson International Airport in the enterprise risk management team, supporting them with creating their business continuity framework and also supporting with the creation of the disaster recovery program at Toronto Pearson. So I just think that our ability to manage risk in business at for whatever size of the company that we work for. I currently work with more small and medium-sized enterprises in my own business. I just think risk is a really fascinating and important aspect of managing a business effectively. So again, if you could, I would love to hear where you're joining from and what you're hoping to get out of the session. If you could put that in the question box. So I just wanted to kind of outline this journey. This is the first in kind of a 3-part journey into risk management. So today we're going to be talking about, we're going to be going over a high-level introduction to integrated risk management. And then on September 22nd, I'll be doing another workshop at the same time. So 12 to 1 on September 22nd, looking at enterprise risk management frameworks and introducing you to an easy 10-step process for identifying and implementing a enterprise risk management program at the companies that you work for. And then finally, on October 20th, we'll be diving into the worlds of business continuity management and disaster recovery. So I'll be sharing with you from my experiences of creating the enterprise risk management framework for Toronto Pearson International Airport. And, oh, you can type in the chat. That's great. I didn't know that. So on October 20th, we will be looking at business continuity management and disaster recovery, as I said. So I just kind of wanted to provide a little bit of context before we dive into my objectives for what we're here to accomplish today. And again, if there's anything specific that you are looking to get out of this conversation, please put it in the question section. And if, oh, you're joining from Morocco, that's amazing, incredible. If we don't cover it today, I'd love to hear from you, because I can definitely make sure to integrate it and have those conversations on September 22nd and October 20th. All right, so we're here for the hour. We'll be wrapping up by 1 p.m. So our objectives for today. Well, first, we are here to define what integrated risk management is and understand the importance of this to your business. So integrated risk management, we'll get a little bit more into it, was really created in 2016 as a function of work done by Gartner. We're going to distinguish the difference between governance and risk and compliance, enterprise risk management, and integrated risk management. So what are each of these? How do we define them? And what do they cover? We're also, Taiwo, you're from Nigeria. I'm loving it. Thank you so much for interacting and sharing with me where you're joining the session from. That's really great. We're also going to break down and understand the 6 practice areas of integrated risk management as defined by Gartner. We're going to understand the importance of integrating culture and technology into your integrated risk management strategy. And we'll talk about the advantages of it having integrated risk management. And we're also I'm going to be providing an overview of an approach to implementing an IRM strategy in your business. So I'm a philosopher at heart. I did my undergraduate degree in philosophy. So in my world, we always start by defining our terms. So we're going to start by defining what do we mean by integrated risk management. Then I'm going to provide an overview, a little bit of history where integrated risk management came from. And then again, as I said, we're going to get into the difference between governance, risk, and compliance, ERM and IRM. We'll look at the 6 practice areas of integrated risk management: strategy, assessment, response, communication and reporting, monitoring, and technology. Then, as I said, we're going to go through a program development approach, and then we'll wrap up and we'll talk about what's next in terms of the next webinar that's coming on September 22nd. And there will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end, but as we're going, if I look like I'm looking over to the other side of my screen at all, it's because I'm monitoring kind of the question portal. So if you have any additional questions or there's anything else that you want to understand, please put the questions there and I'll answer them as best I can as we go through. So according to Gartner, integrated risk management is a set of practices and processes supported by a risk-aware culture and enabling technologies that improves decision-making and performance through an integrated view of how well an organization manages its unique set of risks. Risk and uncertainty is unavoidable and always present. And I think this past year has driven that home for businesses for businesses of every size, whether you're a startup, someone who's just starting as an entrepreneur, or whether you're an established company. COVID, the pandemic, and the resulting impacts of that have made us all aware that whatever certainty we thought existed in the world really is an illusion. If you could also put in the chat, for those of you that are joining live, whether you work for a company or whether you're a business owner yourself, that would help me understand kind of who I'm talking to this afternoon. So what we're talking about when we're talking about risk, whether it's positive or negative, is the effect of uncertainty on the objectives, on projects, on objectives, on the goals of an organization or an enterprise. We're wanting to understand the likelihood or impact of those risks, whether they be positive or negative, in order to make sure that we have the appropriate strategies necessary in order to be able to properly manage those risks and monitor them over time. So when we look at the difference between governance, risk, and compliance, which is really an integrated collection of capabilities that enable organizations to realize and achieve objectives and address uncertainty. Typically, governance, and if you look at the kind of the history of risk management, GRC is where things started. GRC, you know, in 2002, with a number of emerging financial scandals that happened, the Sarbanes-Oxley laws were created, and all of a sudden, corporations had to be responsible for making sure that they had the internal processes in place in order to make sure that they were monitoring and managing compliance and risk, and that they had the governance in place to make sure that this was being done. Typically, GRC is owned by the governance team or legal or the strategy department of a company. When we get into enterprise risk management, we're talking about the high-level strategic planning and management of the risks by various different functions within a company, but typically including the board of directors and the C-suite, right? So annual processes of assessing, identifying, and assessing, and ensuring that the appropriate governance and controls are in place to make sure that risks are being managed to the level at which the company deems necessary based on its risk appetite and tolerance, which we'll talk more about in a few moments. To go back to global risk compliance, like governance, risk, and compliance, typically GRC is looked at in terms of 3 lines of defense. So the first line of defense is activities taking place by management or frontline workers. Then we have the second line of defense, which is your organization's assurance processes. And then finally, the internal audit function, or it could be even external audit functions, but the audit function, someone independent coming in and reviewing the activities of a company in order to make sure that they're abiding by, you know, whatever internal and external regulatory and compliance that's necessary for that enterprise. So in integrated risk management, remember our definition was a set of practices and processes supported by culture and technology. We're talking about the technical controls, policies, and procedures, the hands-on work that happens day to day in organizations that makes enterprise risk management possible. Now, what's more important? Well, really, none of them are more important than the other. They all represent different facets of being able to manage risk for an organization. And again, I want to stress, to the unique needs of every company. No 2 companies are the same. The needs of that company around how they manage risk are unique. So the whole point of undertaking this is to make sure that whatever risk management that you have in place, it's appropriate to the unique set of concerns that your company is dealing with. So as I said, integrated risk management involves 6 practice areas that we're going to get into in a few moments that work in conjunction together. In 2016, Gardner, in the process of reassessing and revisiting global governance and risk and compliance and enterprise risk management, determined that while these both were critical to the organization, there were also gaps that were identified. So Gardner created a high-level framework to address the strategy as well as the hands-on work of actually executing on enterprise risk management in corporations ongoingly. It could be considered to be an umbrella approach that bridges enterprise risk management and governance and risk compliance, governance, risk, and compliance. So why integrated risk management? Well, IRM exposes risk management gaps and enables you and the companies that you work for to proactively monitor, track, and implement compliance within your organization. So now let's get into the practice areas. And as we're going through this, I would love to hear from those that are here live with me. What are some of the risks that you deal with in the companies that you work for today? What are some of the challenges that you're dealing with in regards to risk and risk management for the companies that you work for? So the first practice area of integrated risk management is having an appropriate strategy, defined as the enablement and implementation of a framework that includes performance improvement through effective governance and risk ownership. So the need is to develop an integrated risk management, again, that's unique to your company, that's in line with your company's strategy, goals, and objectives. We're talking about having a shared implementation or a shared, interpretation across all risk functions within the company. When we come kind of to the end of this conversation, we're going to be talking about risk culture and what makes a good, healthy risk culture within an organization. And part of that is that everyone within the organization understands what works or what doesn't work. I don't really prefer the terms good and bad, but sometimes they're appropriate. And in the case of risk, perhaps they are. So what are the boundaries for what's good and bad when it comes to risk within this enterprise? So that there's complete transparency and clarity. People understand the actions that work and don't work for the company that they're working for. And that starts at the beginning with having a strategy that's aligned to corporate goals and objectives. We also want to make sure that the strategy is aligned to and reflective of the company's risk tolerance and appetites. And both a company's risk tolerance and appetite set the boundaries for how much risk a company is willing to accept. Because remember, risk isn't necessarily positive or negative, right? Whether risk is positive or negative, and we're going to get into that a little bit more when we talk about risk response. But whether risk is positive or negative is about the impact that the materialization of that risk would have to the company. So if the effect of that uncertainty on the company is threatening to the goals and objectives of the company, it's determined that that risk is negative. And if the effect of that risk is positive, right, is an opportunity, represents an opportunity for the company, then we would deem that risk to be a positive risk. So the risk appetite is defined as the amount and type of risk that an organization is prepared to pursue, retain, or take on behalf of the organization. And the tolerance is a measurement of exactly how much loss the organization is willing to experience in the pursuit of its objectives. making sure that the strategy is aligned with the strategic goals of the organization. Make sure that we spell out clear guidelines and standards that reflect the limitations and goals of that organization, so that you can actually have a risk-aware culture. And again, we're going to get into more of what that means in a little bit. So some of the, and you could be asking yourself at this point in time, like, who owns risk in the company? And one of a helpful tool that you might use when determining the strategy and kind of looking at, and we'll talk about communications and reporting in a little bit, but I think the RACI tool, responsibility matrices, that kind of thought process that you go through, for those of you that are familiar with this from the world of project management, right? Who's responsible for what? Ultimately, who's accountable? Who has the ownership for specific risks within the organization? Who needs to be consulted and who needs to be informed? Asking these kinds of questions can help you identify, not the appropriate communication strategies, as well as who needs to be involved in the ongoing activities of treating and monitoring risks over time. So practice area 2 relates to assessment, which is really the identification, evaluation, and prioritizations of risk. So how do you prioritize risks in the company that you work with today, whether it's your company or a company that you're working for? How do you identify the risks that are important for you in your market, with your supply chain, with how the processes by which you carry out the business that you're undertaking, whatever the service good or products are that you serve your clients or customers through? So this assessment is an enterprise-wide exercise to first identify what those risks are, evaluate the risks. So when we're talking about evaluating risk, we're talking about what is the likelihood that this risk is going to materialize, either positive or negative. What are the chances that this risk is actually going to come to fruition? And if it does, what's the impact to our ability to achieve our objectives as an organization as a result? We prioritize risk based on criteria that are unique to each organization, based on the goals and objectives and the business that organization is in. The prioritization and evaluation of risk will determine our risk response. I think it's important to note at this point in time that not all risks need to be managed in the same way. And the ways in which we deal with risk will be determined by our evaluation and prioritization of them to the organization. So risk response. Once we've identified the risks, what are the different strategies, right? The identification and implementation of mechanisms to mitigate risk. So remember, positive risk equals an opportunity or can be seen as opportunities to the business, whereas negative risks are threats. So typically, and there's a great acronym that you can use to remember how to respond to risks, or the different ways to respond. And they are different based on whether it's a positive risk or a negative risk. So for negative risks, the typical risk responses or strategies to deal with that risk can be understood through the acronym MATA, so M-A-T-A. So the M stands for mitigate. So if we're mitigating a negative risk, then we're putting in place some kind of action that we're going to undertake to reduce either the likelihood or the impact of that risk should it materialize. So it could be that we're going to pay for additional services, or we're going to, you know, if we have a project and we have a critical task and it's on the critical path for the project, we could choose to throw additional resources at that task to ensure that it gets done in the amount of time that we need it to be done in. The first A stands for accept. So there are certain risks. If the return on investment of carrying out the activity is sufficient, and the risk is something that we can't actually do anything about, then we may choose to just accept the risk and move on. The T stands for transfer, right? So in this case, the strategy that we're using is to transfer the risk to a third party. The most typical example of transferring risk is insurance. Most people have done that, right? Either house insurance, life insurance, car insurance, right? We all drive around in our cars on the road, for those of us that do, right? Safe in the knowledge that should we get into an accident, we have the ability to either make the other person whole or ourselves and take care of our medical expenses, as well as, depending on the level of insurance that we buy, we can also take care of the physical asset of our car. The final kind of typical risk response for dealing with negative risk is avoidance. So it could be that if the impact and if the likelihood that this risk is going to materialize is really great, or that the impact of the risk materializing is so high, we may choose to avoid taking the action altogether. Sorry, I was just looking at a comment from someone. So when it comes to positive risk, the acronym to remember the strategies is EASE, E-A-S-E. So when it comes to, again, a positive risk is a condition, event, occurrence, or situation that provides a positive impact for a project or enterprise. So it could be something like an emerging technology, or a policy change, or perhaps applying for and getting grants that will help your business. So our options in dealing with positive risk, one, we could enhance the risk. We could enhance the likelihood. So for example, if you're looking at grants, you could apply for more grants and increase the likelihood that you're going to receive funds through grants. Again, we have the strategy of accepting. So basically what we're saying here is we're accepting that the positive risk might materialize, but we're not going to take any action to make sure that that risk materializes or increase the likelihood of the risk materializing. We could share. So in an effort to increase the likelihood or the impact of that risk, should it materialize, we could work with a third party. So this is similar to the transfer treatment and negative risk. But really, we're working with a third party to increase our likelihood that that risk is going to materialize in our company. And then finally, we have accept. No, sorry, I lied. We have exploit. So when we're talking about exploiting, we are at this point in time aggressively pursuing any actions that we can to improve the likelihood, increase the likelihood that that positive risk will materialize. So each of these represent mechanisms that we can to either mitigate risk or to deal with risk in some way. So practice area 4 in Gardner's framework for integrated risk management is communication and reporting. This is about the provision of the best or most appropriate means to track and inform stakeholders of an enterprise's risk response. And this really starts with, to me, in my mind, stakeholder analysis. It starts with understanding who all of the stakeholders are that are involved, that are impacted, that need to be considered and included, whether they be people who are responsible for monitoring or responding to risk, or there are people who are like ultimately accountable, have ownership over that risk to the business. Or it could be, again, that these are people that need to be consulted about how best to manage the risk for the company, or informed and kept in the loop. But it really starts with who needs to know what, when, and in what format. We're not communicating just for the sake of communicating. We're ensuring that the expenditure of resources through our reporting and communicating are actually impacting our ability to respond to risk in the organization. Another element that's really important here is to make sure that whatever regulatory reporting is required, and that will depend heavily on the industry that you work in the sector. The needs for regulatory reporting for the financial sector or pharmaceutical companies would be very different than someone who's operating, a mom and pop coffee shop or clothing store, right? So every business deals with uncertainty, every business deals with risk, but who we need to communicate what to and how we need to report risk will depend on the kind of business that we're in. A big part of any risk management program and our fifth practice area for Gardner's framework is monitoring. So I'm not going to read this big definition of what they mean. This comes from their framework themselves. But essentially what we're talking about in monitoring are activities focused on understanding changes to the environment and specific risks to the organization. So I'd love to hear from those of you that are here, how do you monitor risks today, right? What are the processes, or maybe this is a gap for you, but what are the ongoing processes of your company to identify, evaluate existing risks as well as potentially emerging risks through the day-to-day activities of your company? It's also important to note that part of this process of monitoring risks includes the identification of metrics that will be used to monitor the risk. So say, for example, we identify, and this is one of the big things when I worked at the airport, you can imagine for a company like that, reputation around how passengers are treated, reputation around the relationship between the different, essentially an airport is, and I love talking about the airport, it's one of my favorite places that I ever worked. Essentially an airport does three seemingly simple things, right? They move passengers and cargo, they move baggage, and they move aircraft, right? And then to manage the flow of those three things. The complication in operating an airport comes, and the risk comes in all of the different individuals and stakeholder groups that are required in order to be able to make that happen. And in general, the environment, right, all of the things that go into making aviation safe for both the people who work at airports, for people who travel, and for all of those different stakeholder groups. So reputation risk is something that's very important. to an organization that runs an airport. But what are the specific metrics that we're going to use, that you're going to use, in order to be able to understand whether the risk is being managed or not, and whether or not the risk is being managed to the level at which you've deemed important or necessary for the company that you work for. As well as the metric, it's also important to note whether you have the data that's required in order to be able to manage and track those metrics. So where is that data located? How are you getting the data on a regular basis? And how are you, in fact, what are the technologies or tools that you need in order to be able to turn that data into usable information with which to make decisions about the organization? So monitoring, as I said, is part of your ongoing risk management program. And I'm just reading a comment from Morad. So, and it is most important to integrating risk monitoring and control with project. Absolutely, right? So, not really the focus of this conversation necessarily, but in any organization, right, we have our strategic goals and objectives at the top, the kind of, the vision, mission, values of the company, that then what the company exists for, why are we even here? And then from that, we determine strategic goals and objectives and our project and department objectives, right? All of these need to be aligned. And then from those departmental objectives, we have our projects, programs, and portfolios, right? Different elements of work and our operational work that's going into making sure that the company is doing what it exists for. And so, Morad, you're absolutely correct, right? We want to be making sure that the work of the projects is aligned, and whatever's happening on projects is aligned to the overall enterprise risk monitoring and control. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that's so important when we talk about risk culture. So some of the questions that you could be asking during the monitoring phase is, how is the risk changing? What are the effects of those changes, or what effects will those changes have on our objectives or on other factors, both internal and external, to the operating environment? And something that, if you look at things from a positive risk point of view, are we actually, in fact, taking sufficient risk in order to achieve our objectives? So every company will have a different risk appetite and tolerance, depending on the nature of the work that's done and who's involved. And sometimes if companies have too risk adverse an appetite, then they could be missing out on opportunities to improve both the operations or their market share, and could be negatively impacting their ability to achieve their objectives as quickly as possible. So we want to make sure that we're clear about, this is why this is so important, because when we're clear about what the risks are to our enterprise, and we make sure that they're prioritized and that we have appropriate responses to them, and that they're being monitored, then we can make sure that we're doing everything that we can to balance positive and negative risk and uncertainty with achieving the goals and objectives of the company. Thank you for that, Mariah. So the next practice area, or the last practice area, as laid out by Gardner, is the use of technology. So they talk about designing and implementation of an integrated risk management solution and architecture. And this is really about the effective, efficient, and agile use of resources. So if you think about all of the things that we've talked about up until this point in time, an integrated risk management system program could be very resource heavy without tools that enable its effective use in the organization. So by leveraging technology, we're able to ensure that we're responding and monitoring risk in such a way that doesn't eat up a lot of the time of the resources of the individuals who are managing the risk day in and day out on behalf of the company. So you could take kind of a three-step approach to looking at and implementing an integrated risk management solution. Some of them sometimes called enterprise risk management solutions. And I want to know before I kind of talk about these steps is that there is, like anything worth doing in life, there can be considerable upfront effort. It can take a lot of time and resources to make sure this is done right. For anyone here or listening to this webinar who's participated in a business intelligence initiative at the enterprise level, these types of engagements and change initiatives do not necessarily happen quickly, and it's like garbage in, garbage out, right? So we want to make sure that we're doing the proper work up front to make sure that what we're creating is actually going to meet the business needs. And in fact, will have us gain those efficiencies and make us more effective in the day-to-day activities of monitoring and managing risk. So the first step that you want to undertake in this process of looking at technology would be an internal environmental analysis, right? So you're going to be considering the big picture. Why? What's motivating us to procure and onboard technology to support with managing and monitoring risk? What are our current processes? How are we doing this today? What are our pain points with the current processes? Perhaps it's too labor intensive, perhaps it's paper based. Maybe we're collecting all of this data, but we're not actually able to leverage the data that we're collecting in order to be able to make quick business decisions about risk and how risk is being managed. Perhaps the current process of how risk is managed in this company or monitored makes it difficult to be able to provide updates and information to the executive and to the board of directors. One of the big things that, how are we managing corrective actions? We'll talk more about corrective actions when we have the webinar on business continuity management and disaster recovery, because those are kind of a bit more of the pointy end of the stick, right? In terms of strategies or specific strategies that companies use in order to be able to manage and monitor risk. But, all of the corrective actions that we collect, lessons learned about how risk is being managed or monitored day in and day out from the company, how are we tracking those? These are all potentially pain points that we're dealing with that would have us want to implement technology to be able to support that. So like any good, here I'm going to put my business analysis hat on, like any good business analyst, we want to start as part of our internal environmental analysis looking at consulting end users. Who are the people who are going to be using this technology day in and day out, and making sure that we have their needs and that we understand what their stakeholder requirements are. Far too often, my experience has been companies start with the looking at a specific tool or technology. But ideally, we would start with, like, we have this business need, we have these business requirements, and who are the stakeholders that need to be consulted in order to make sure that whatever solution we go with in the long term, that they're going to be able to use it. And then finally, because of the nature of what this kind of solution does in an organization, we definitely want to make sure that we're consulting with our internal IT resources and legal teams. Right? We want to understand from an IT point of view, what are some of the boundaries, what's the current existing infrastructure, either from a data or business intelligence point of view, as well as understanding from a legal point of view, what are the specific business rules You could also include consulting with the governance team here if you have one. But what are the business rules around how this technology would need to be implemented within the organization? Step 2, and looking at buying in technology, procuring technology to support with risk management, would be determining what your needs are. And this is like really about business requirements, right? Business stakeholder and functional and non-functional requirements. So what are our primary and secondary needs, or what's required in order to have the solution achieve our business need? What are the musts? What are the features and functions that must be there in the solution in order for us to achieve our goals? What are some of the things that are more nice to have or should be there? And then what could we include if time and resources allow for it? Using this kind of approach to identifying requirements and prioritizing requirements in any technology solution, and really in the creation of any solution at all, will enable you to make sure that when you go to step 3, which is providing choosing a vendor, that you are clear about what has to be in the solution in order for it to be able to meet your needs. Step 3 is really about doing the research, looking at all of the different options that are available in the marketplace, collecting references, perhaps having demos of different software applications. And then once you have an understanding of the different solutions that you could procure, you want to calculate your return on investment. So what's the value we're going to get out of this? How much is it going to cost us? How much, once we operationalize the solution, how much is it going to, what kind of resourcing is going to be required to manage this going forward? All of these things need to be considered. I'm not here to make a plug for any particular solution in general, and I only say this because I know that they are, kind of #1 rated by Gartner. I have had personal experience working with Logic Manager, and their team was fantastic. We used their tool to support our enterprise risk management and business continuity management programs at Toronto Pearson Airport when I worked there. And beyond the technology, which was well designed and very effective, I just can't say enough about the team that I worked with in terms of their ability to support us ongoingly. So that's one solution. There's many different providers out there, and you need to look and balance all of the different needs you have versus what the different vendors offer when making, and I'm going to say this again, when making any technology purchase, as well as when looking at specifically for the area that we're talking here in integrated risk management. So we've spent some time talking about kind of processes and practices and technology. I wanted to talk now about the piece around culture. And really all 3 of these work together, but culture really is like the water we swim in companies, right? It's the attitudes and mindset and beliefs and actions taken by employees that either will have a company move closer to achieving its objectives, or can sometimes have the opposite effect, right? So how do people take ownership? Are people taking ownership of risk? Is it like, do people have the attitude that they're personally responsible? Not like at fault or to blame, but I could be in a company like I'm 100% responsible for how things go here. Have we created a safe space with which to talk about risk, so that if people do identify or notices practices that are not consistent with the company's risk policies, is there a safe space for people to feel like they can come forward and discuss it? In risk culture, we're talking about how the organization and its people talk, think, and act with respect to risk management. So do we have clear boundaries and guidelines, right? I said this earlier in the conversation. Are people crystal clear about what's expected from them vis-a-vis risk? Do they understand what the guidelines are around what works and doesn't work in this company? See, not specifically related to this conversation, but I think it's important to note that as human beings, and this is kind of from the work I do in mindset, human beings never come to anything in life an empty vessel. Well, I shouldn't say never, because there's always an exception that proves the rule, but almost never do human beings come to anything empty, with nothing. So people who are coming into your organization, they have experiences of how risk was managed at other companies. They have beliefs about what's appropriate or not appropriate, about what works or doesn't work. And so it's important to make sure that we have clearly defined for employees and managers and like anyone who works in a company, what's expected of them with regards to risk where they work today. We're looking at behaviors here. Is there strong and open communication? Is there are people clear on what the committed lines of listening are for escalation if they've identified risky behavior? Are people kind of always considering risk when making decisions or acting on behalf of the organization? Are people choosing to take personal responsibility for the risks and the controls? Is there a culture of telling the truth? Are people being conscientious about the impact of their actions on the organization? And with all of what we're talking about here, are their actions aligned and congruent with what's expected of them? So you can think for yourself, in the organizations that you work in, what actions would be aligned to the kind of risk management and monitoring practices? What would you see people doing? And we know from the work in neural, like our brain and brain science, that people's actions are a direct function, like correlate to their thinking and that to their beliefs. So this is why this conversation around mindset and attitude is so important, because people's the mindset that the employees have will directly impact through their subconscious mind the actions that they take or don't. So if it occurs for them that risk is not their problem, it's someone else's to manage, then that's how the kind of actions that they're going to take are going to be correlate to that. So the final thing I wanted to talk with you about this morning, before we kind of touch on the advantages of integrated risk management, is this high-level approach. And this may not be this is a pretty standard management approach. I use this whether I'm working with my private clients as a coach or with many of the companies that I consult with, right? So we want to start out by looking at best practices. So what's the future state we're building, right? And we do that through looking at how other people are in our industry or sector are managing risks. So what's going to work for us in our company? What's the future state we're building? Then we also want to review our current state. What are we doing today? What works or doesn't work about the way in which we're managing risk today? What's missing? I personally really love these frames, right? I've really shifted myself. I mentioned this earlier, away from talking about good and bad. There tends to be a little bit of a moral significance to the terms good or bad that I don't necessarily find empowers people and creates an environment in which people feel completely free to talk candidly about what's going on. So I think it's, and especially if I think Murad, you clearly, I'm assuming, work in projects in the project space. Many of you might who are watching this. You know, when it comes time to do lessons learned, like what was good or bad about this project, not as doesn't create as safe a space as talking about like what really worked about how we managed this. What really worked about how we executed this project? What didn't work? What could have been missing that if we put that in would have had us be more effective at accomplishing our objectives? And then you can apply that to anywhere in life, both personally and professionally. So once you've understood and reviewed your current state, you want to identify improvement opportunities. You want to identify improvement opportunities. So what are our gaps? Do we have gaps around technology? Do we have gaps around process? Do we have gaps around the resources to be able to actually execute on a program like this? Perhaps there's gaps in terms of the positions in the organization. Are there training gaps? So we identified all of the different opportunities to improve based on, right? And it's all in alignment with where it is that we want to get to in the future. What's that future state we're looking to build? And then finally, well, not finally, but the next step in this approach would be to implement the changes, right? So this would involve a series of possibly projects, right? Maybe onboarding new technology, and whatever the changes are, they're going to be in response to the improvement opportunities, which will have been prioritized, right? Based on available resources, money, time, and the priorities of the organization. So you would take all of those opportunities for improvement and determine which, you know, what order are we moving forward with the changes. What's the best use of the resources we have in order to implement an integrated risk management program and make a difference as quickly as possible? And then we see, as always, this ongoing monitoring of compliance against the program, right? So keep in mind, we've got two kind of monitorings that's happening here, right? We have the activities that are taking to monitor the risks themselves. And then we have another set of activities that are monitoring people's compliance with, that are taken to monitor people's compliance with the actual risk management program. So why do all of this? At the end of the day, right, why do all of this? Well, first, better risk identification and management. We will have more accurate risk analysis, better decision making, less financial loss, and you will create in your organization a more proactive risk culture. Just a more proactive culture in general. Improved operational efficiencies. So with a single source of truth around risk and all of the processes and technology to support, you're going to make this repository of risk and associated artifacts and all of it available to all levels of the company and all departments. So you create a single source of truth for this company with regards to how risk is managed. By providing a more risk mature company philosophy, these things feed one another, right? So the more proactive the culture, the more a reduction of risk and risky behavior that we're going to see over time. See, the interesting thing about risky behavior, you think about texting and driving here, the more people get away with doing risky behavior, the more likely they are to do it in the future. So we want to create a culture in which people are aware of what are their individual responsibility when it comes to risk at this company. How do they make sure that they're personally doing what they need to do in order to be able to manage risk? And then the larger scope of opportunities, by becoming more proactive, and I'm glad that you like it, Murad, that's awesome. We have better insights into the risks, positive and negative for our company will increase the likelihood of us benefiting from opportunities and create better outcomes for the business. So what's next? As I said, on September 22nd at 12 o'clock, I'm going to be introducing you to an easy 10-step framework for how to implement ERM at the companies that you work with. So I'd love to have each of you back. Thank you for coming today and participating in this conversation. I did promise that I would take time for questions. I do apologize. We are right at the top of the hour. So what I'm suggesting is I can give you my email, and if you have any specific questions for me, please email me them and I will follow up with you. And then the other thing that you could do is bring those questions to the next session and we can talk about them there. So my email is ahoward@amberhowardinc.com. So please, if you have any specific questions, I do apologize for going right to the top of the hour. And the final thing I want to say is just thank you. You could have done anything with the last hour of your time, and I really appreciate you taking the time to, to be here and be in this conversation with me. And I look forward to seeing you back. It's great to have representation from kind of all over the world and people in different countries. And I look forward to connecting with you again on September 22nd. And for those of you that are interested in kind of a little bit more of the mindset piece, I'm doing a workshop. I think it's 8 p.m. It's on our website, 8 p.m. on August 17th, so next week, on a framework for how to become unstuck in life. All right, so thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful afternoon, and thank you so much for your time. Take care, everyone.